Chapter 16, Part 2 of the Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, compiled from her letters and journals by her son Charles Edward Stowe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, The Civil War, 1860 through 1865, Part 2. This address, splendidly illuminated on vellum, was sent to our shores at the head of 26 folio volumes containing considerably more than 500,000 of signatures of British women. It was forwarded to me with a letter from a British nobleman now occupying one of the highest official positions in England, with a request on behalf of these ladies that it should be in any possible way presented to the attention of my countrywomen. This memorial, as it now stands in its solid oaken case with its heavy folios, each bearing on its back the imprint of the American eagle, forms a most unique library, a singular monument of an international expression of a moral idea. No right-thinking person can find aught to be objected against the substance or form of this memorial. It is temperate, just, and kindly, and on the high ground of Christian equality where it places itself, may be regarded as a perfectly proper expression of sentiment, as between blood relations and equals in two different nations. The signatures to this appeal are not the least remarkable part of it, for, beginning at the very steps of the throne, they go down to the names of women in the very humblest conditions in life, and represent all that Great Britain possesses, not only of highest and wisest, but of plain, homely common sense and good feeling. Names of wives of cabinet ministers appear on the same page with the names of wives of humble laborers. Names of duchesses and countesses, of wives of generals, ambassadors, savants, and men of letters, mingled with names traced with trembling characters by hands evidently unused to hold the pen and stiffened by lowly toil. Nay, so deep and expensive was the feeling that British subjects in foreign lands had their representation. Among the signatures are those of foreign residents from Paris to Jerusalem. Autographs so diverse and collected from sources so various have seldom been found in juxtaposition. They remain at this day a silent witness of a most singular tide of feeling which at that time swept over the British community, and made for itself an expression, even at the risk of offending the sensibilities of an equal and powerful nation. No reply to that address in any such tangible and monumental form has ever been possible. It was impossible to canvass our vast territories with the zealous and indefatigable industry with which England was canvassed for signatures. In America, those possessed of the spirit which led to this efficient action had no leisure for it. All their time and energies were already absorbed in direct efforts to remove the great evil, concerning which the minds of their English sisters had been newly aroused, and their only answer was the silent continuance of these efforts. From the slave-holding states, however, as was to be expected, came a flood of indignant recrimination and rebuke. No one act, perhaps, ever produced more fanatic irritation or called out more unsparing abuse. It came with the whole united weight of the British aristocracy and commonalty on the most diseased and sensitive part of our national life, and it stimulated that fierce excitement which was working before and has worked since, till it has broken out into open war. The time has come, however, when such an astonishing page has been turned in the anti-slavery history of America, that the women of our country, feeling that the great anti-slavery work to which their English sisters exhorted them is almost done, may properly and naturally feel moved to reply to their appeal and lay before them the history of what has occurred since the receipt of their affectionate and Christian address. Your address reached us just as a great moral conflict was coming to its intensest point. The agitation kept up by the anti-slavery portion of America, by England, and by the general sentiment of humanity in Europe had made the situation of the slaveholding aristocracy intolerable. As one of them at the time expressed it, they felt themselves under the ban of the civilized world. Two courses only were open to them: to abandon slave institutions, the sources of their wealth and political power, or to assert them with such an overwhelming national force as to compel the respect and assent of mankind. They chose the latter. To this end they determined to seize on and control all the resources of the federal government, and to spread their institutions through new states and territories until the balance of power should fall into their hands, and they should be able to force slavery into all the free states. A leading Southern senator boasted that he would yet call the roll of his slaves on Bunker Hill, and for a while the political successes of the slave power were such as to suggest to New England that this was no impossible event. They repealed the Missouri Compromise, which had hitherto stood like the Chinese wall between the Northwest Territories and the eruptions of slave-holding barbarians. Then came the struggle between freedom and slavery in the new territory, the battle for Kansas and Nebraska, fought with fire and sword and blood, where a race of men, of whom John Brown was the immortal type, acted over again the courage, the perseverance, and the military religious ardor of the old Covenanters of Scotland, and like them redeemed the Ark of Liberty at the price of their own blood, and blood dearer than their own. The time of the presidential canvasses, which elected Mr. Lincoln, was the crisis of this great battle. The conflict had become narrowed down to the one point of the extension of slave territory. If the slaveholders could get states enough, they could control and rule. If they were outnumbered by free states, their institutions, by the very law of their nature, would die of suffocation. Therefore, fugitive slave law, District of Columbia, interstate slave trade, and what not, were all thrown out of sight for a grand rally on this vital point. A president was elected pledged to opposition to this one thing alone, a man known to be in favor of the fugitive slave law and other so-called compromises of the Constitution, but honest and faithful in his determination on this one subject. That this was indeed the vital point was shown by the result. The moment Lincoln's election was ascertained, the slaveholders resolved to destroy the Union they could no longer control. They met and organized a confederacy, which they openly declared to be the first republic founded on the right and determination of the white man to enslave the black man, and spreading their banners, declared themselves to the Christian world of the 19th century as a nation organized with the full purpose and intent of perpetuating slavery. But in the course of the struggle that followed, it became important for the new Confederation to secure the assistance of foreign powers, and infinite pains were then taken to blind and bewilder the mind of England as to the real issues of the conflict in America. It has been often and earnestly asserted that slavery had nothing to do with this conflict, that it was a mere struggle for power, that the only object was to restore the Union as it was, with all its abuses. It is to be admitted that expressions have proceeded from the national administration which naturally gave rise to misapprehension, and therefore we beg to speak to you on this subject more fully. At first, the declaration of the Confederate States themselves is proof enough that, whatever may be declared on the other side, the maintenance of slavery is regarded by them as the vital object of their movement. We ask your attention under this head to the declaration of their Vice President, Stephens, in that remarkable speech delivered on the 21st of March, 1861, at Savannah, Georgia, wherein he declares the object and purpose of the new Confederacy. It is one of the most extraordinary papers which our century has produced. I quote from the verbatim report in the Savannah Republican of the address as delivered in the Athenaeum of that city, on which occasion, says the newspapers from which I copy, quote, Mr. Stephens took his seat amid a burst of enthusiasm and applause such as the Athenaeum has never had displayed within its walls within the recollection of the oldest inhabitant. End quote. Last, not least, the new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery as it exists among us, the proper status quo of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. Jefferson, in his forecast, had anticipated this as the rock upon which the old Union would split. He was right. What was a conjecture with him is now a realized fact. But whether he fully comprehended the great truth upon which that rock stood and stands may be doubted. The prevailing ideas entertained by him and most of the leading statesmen at the time of the formation of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. In the meantime, during the past year, the Republican administration, with all the unwonted care of organizing an army and navy and conducting military operations on an immense scale, have proceeded to demonstrate the feasibility of overthrowing slavery by purely constitutional measures. To this end, they have instituted a series of movements which have made this year more fruitful in anti-slavery triumphs than any other since the emancipation of the British West Indies. The District of Columbia, as belonging strictly to the national government and to no separate state, has furnished a fruitful subject of remonstrance from British Christians with America. We have abolished slavery there, and thus wiped out the only blot of territorial responsibility on our escutcheon. By another act, equally grand in principle and far more important in its results, slavery is forever excluded from the territories of the United States. By another act, America has consummated the long-delayed treaty with Great Britain for the suppression of the slave trade. In ports whence slave vessels formerly sailed, with the connivance of the port officers, the administration has placed men who stand up to their duty, and for the first time in our history, the slave trader is convicted and hung as a pirate. This abominable secret traffic has been wholly demolished by the energy of the federal government. Lastly, and more significant still, the United States government has in its highest official capacity taken distinct anti-slavery ground and presented to the country a plan of peaceable emancipation with suitable compensation. This noble-spirited and generous offer has been urged on the slave-holding states by the chief executive with earnestness and sincerity. But this is but half the story of the anti-slavery triumphs of this year. We have shown you what has been done for freedom by the simple use of the ordinary constitutional forces of the Union. We are now to show you what has been done to the same end by the constitutional war power of the nation. By this power it has been this year decreed that every slave of a rebel who reaches the lines of our army becomes a free man, that all slaves found deserted by their masters become free men, that every slave employed in any service for the United States thereby obtains his liberty, and that every slave employed against the United States in any capacity obtains his liberty. And lest the army should contain officers disposed to remand slaves to their masters, the power of judging and delivering up slaves is denied to army officers, and all such acts are made penal. By this act, the fugitive slave law is for all present purposes practically repealed. With this understanding and provision, wherever our armies march, they carry liberty with them. For be it remembered that our army is almost entirely a volunteer one, and that the most zealous and ardent volunteers are those who have been for years fighting, with tongue and pen, the abolition battle. So marked is the character of our soldiers in this respect that they are now familiarly designated in the official military dispatches of the Confederate States as the abolitionists. Conceive the results when an army so empowered by national law marches through a slave territory. One regiment alone has, to our certain knowledge, liberated 2,000 slaves during the past year, and this regiment is but one out of hundreds. Lastly, the great decisive measure of the war has appeared, the President's proclamation of emancipation. This also has been much misunderstood and misrepresented in England. It has been said to mean virtually this: be loyal and you shall keep your slaves, rebel and they shall be free. But let us remember what we have just seen of the purpose and meaning of the Union to which the rebellious states are invited back. It is to a union which has abolished slavery in the District of Columbia and interdicted slavery in the territories, which vigorously represses the slave trade and hangs the convicted slaver as a pirate, which necessitates emancipation by denying expansion to slavery and facilitates it by the offer of compensation. Any slaveholding states which should return to such a union might fairly be supposed to return with the purpose of peaceable emancipation. The President's proclamation simply means this: come in and emancipate peaceably with compensation. Stay out and I emancipate, nor will I protect you from the consequences. Will our sisters in England feel no heartbeat at that event? Is it not one of the predicted voices of the latter day, saying under the whole heavens, quote, "It is done, the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ"? End quote. And now, sisters of England, in this solemn, expectant hour, let us speak to you of one thing which fills our hearts with pain and solicitude. It is an unaccountable fact, and one which we entreat you seriously to ponder, that the party which has brought the cause of freedom thus far on its way during the past eventful year has found little or no support in England. Sadder than this, the party which makes slavery the chief cornerstone of its edifice finds in England its strongest defenders. The voices that have spoken for us, who contend for liberty, have been few and scattering. God forbid that we should forget those few noble voices, so sadly exceptional in the general outcry against us. They are, alas, too few to be easily forgotten. False statements have blinded the minds of your community and turned the most generous sentiments of the British heart against us. The North are fighting for supremacy, and the South for independence, has been the voice. Independence? For what? To do what? To prove the doctrine that all men are not equal? To establish the doctrine that the white may enslave the Negro? In the beginning of our struggle, the voices that reached us across the water said, if we were only sure you were fighting for the abolition of slavery, we should not dare to say whither our sympathy for your cause might not carry us. Such, as we heard, were the words of the honored and religious nobleman who drafted this very letter which you signed and sent us, and to which we are now replying. When these words reached us, we said, quote, we can wait. Our friends in England will soon see whither this conflict is tending. End quote. A year and a half have passed. Step after step have been taken for liberty. Chain after chain has fallen, till the march of our armies is choked and clogged by the glad flocking of emancipated slaves. The day of final emancipation is set. The border states begin to move in voluntary consent. Universal freedom from all dawns like the sun in the distant horizon, and still no voice from England. No voice? Yes, we have heard on the high seas the voice of a war steamer built for a man still in Confederacy, with English gold, in an English dockyard, going out of an English harbor, manned by English sailors, with the full knowledge of English government officers, in defiance of the Queen's proclamation of neutrality. So far has English sympathy overflowed. We have heard of other steamers, ironclad, designed to furnish to the slavery-defending Confederacy their only lack, a navy for the high seas. We have heard that the British Evangelical Alliance refuses to express sympathy with the liberating party when requested to do so by the French Evangelical Alliance. We find in English religious newspapers all those sad degrees in the downward sliding scale of defending and apologizing for slaveholders and slaveholding, with which we have so many years contended in our own country. We find the President's proclamation of emancipation spoken of in those papers only as an incitement to servile insurrection. Nay, more, we find in your papers from thoughtful men the admission of the rapid decline of anti-slavery sentiments in England. This very day the writer of this has been present at a solemn religious festival in the national capital, given at the home of a portion of those fugitive slaves who have fled to our lines for protection. who, under the shadow of our flag, find sympathy and succor. The National Day of Thanksgiving was there kept by over 1,000 redeemed slaves, and for whom Christian charity had spread an ample repast. Our sisters, we wish you could have witnessed the scene. We wish you could have heard the prayer of a blind old Negro, called among his fellows John the Baptist, when, in touching broken English, he poured forth his thanksgivings. We wish you could have heard the sound of that strange rhythmical chant which is now forbidden to be sung on Southern plantations, the psalm of this modern exodus which combines the barbaric fire of the Marseillaise with the religious fervor of the old Hebrew prophet. Oh, go down, Moses, way down into Egypt's land. Tell King Pharaoh to let my people go. Stand away there, and let my people go. As we were leaving, an aged woman came and lifted her hands in blessing. Blessed be the Lord that brought me to see this first happy day of my life. Blessed be the Lord. In all England is there no Amen? We have been shocked and saddened by the question asked in an association of congregational ministers in England, the very blood relations of the liberty-loving Puritans. Why does not the North let the South go? What? Give up the point of emancipation for these 4 million slaves? Turn our backs on them and leave them to their fate? What? Leave our white brothers to run a career of oppression and robbery, that, as sure as there is a God that ruleth in the armies of heaven, will bring down a day of wrath and doom? Remember that wishing success to this slavery-establishing effort is only wishing to the sons and daughters of the South all the curses that God has written against oppression. Mark our words. If we succeed, the children of these very men who are now fighting us will rise up to call us blessed. Just as surely as there is a God who governs in the world, so surely all the laws of national prosperity follow in the train of equity. And if we succeed, we shall have delivered the children's children of our misguided brethren from the wages of sin, which is always and everywhere death. And now, sisters of England, think it not strange if we bring back the words of your letter, not in bitterness, but in deepest sadness, and lay them down at your door. We say to you, sisters, you have spoken well. We have heard you, we have heeded, we have striven in the cause even unto death. We have sealed our devotion by desolate hearth and darkened homestead, by the blood of our sons, husbands, and brothers. In many of our dwellings the very light of our lives has gone out. And yet we accept the lifelong darkness as our own part in this great and awful expiation by which the bonds of wickedness shall be loosed and abiding peace established on the foundation of righteousness. Sisters, what have you done? And what do you mean to do? We appeal to you as sisters, as wives, and as mothers, to raise your voices to your fellow citizens, and your prayers to God for the removal of this affliction and disgrace from the Christian world, in behalf of many thousands of American women. Harriet Beecher Stowe. Washington, November 27th, 1862. The publication of this reply elicited the following interesting letter from John Bright. Rochdale, March 9th, 1863. Dear Mrs. Stowe, I received your kind note with real pleasure, and felt it very good of you to send me a copy of the Atlantic Monthly with your noble letter to the women of England. I read every word of it with an intense interest, and I am quite sure that its effect upon opinion here has been marked and beneficial. It has covered some with shame, and it has compelled many to think, and it has stimulated not a few to act. Before this reaches you, you will have seen what large and earnest meetings have been held in all our towns in favor of abolition and the North. No town has a building large enough to contain those who come to listen, to applaud, and to vote in favor of freedom and the Union. The effect of this is evident on our newspapers and on the tone of Parliament, where now nobody says a word in favor of recognition or mediation or any such thing. The need and duty of England is admitted to be a strict neutrality, but the feeling of the millions of her people is one of friendliness to the United States and its government. It would cause universal rejoicing among all but a limited circle of aristocracy and commercially rich and corrupt to hear that the Northern forces had taken Vicksburg on the great river and Charleston on the Atlantic, and that the neck of the conspiracy was utterly broken. I hope your people may have strength and virtue to win the great cause entrusted to them, but it is fearful to contemplate the amount of the depravity in the North engendered by the long power of slavery. New England is far ahead of the states as a whole, too instructed and too moral, but still I will hope that she will bear the nation through this appalling danger. I well remember the evening at Rome and our conversation. You lamented the election of Buchanan. You judged him with a more unfriendly but a more correct eye than mine. He turned out more incapable and less honest than I hoped for, and I think I was right in saying that your party was not then sufficiently consolidated to enable it to maintain its policy in the execution, even had Fremont been elected. As it is now, 6 years later, the North but falteringly supports the policy of the government, though impelled by the force of events which then you did not dream of. President Lincoln has lived half his troubled reign. In the coming half, I hope he may see land. Surely slavery will be so broken up that nothing can restore and renew it, and, slavery once fairly gone, I know not how all your states can long be kept asunder. Believe me, very sincerely yours, John Bright. It also called forth from Archbishop Wadley the following letter. Palace, Dublin, January, 1863. Dear Madam, in acknowledging your letter and pamphlet, I take the opportunity of laying before you what I collect to be the prevailing sentiments here on American affairs. Of course, there is a great variety of opinion, as may be expected in a country like ours. Some few sympathies with the Northerners and some few with the Southerners, but far the greater portion sympathize with neither completely, but lament that each party should be making so much greater an expenditure of life and property than can be compensated for by any advantage they can dream of obtaining. Those who are the least favorable to the Northerns are not so from any approbation of slavery, but from not understanding that the war is waged in the cause of abolition. It was waged, they say, ostensibly for the restoration of the Union, and in attestation of this they refer to the proclamation which announced the confiscation of slaves that were the property of secessionists, while those who adhered to the federal cause should be exempt from such confiscation, which, they say, did not savor much of zeal for abolition. And if the other object, the restoration of the Union, could be accomplished, which they all regard as hopeless, they do not understand how it will tend to the abolition of slavery. On the contrary, if, say they, the separation had been allowed to take place peaceably, the Northerns might, as we do, have proclaimed freedom to every slave who set foot on their territory, which would have been a great check to slavery, and especially to any cruel treatment of slaves. Many who have a great dislike to slavery yet hold that the Southerners had at least as much right to secede as the Americans had originally the revolt from Great Britain. And there are many who think that, considering the dreadful distress we have suffered from the cotton famine, we have shown great forbearance in withstanding the temptation of recognizing the Southern states and to break the blockade. Then, again, there are some who are provoked by the incessant railing at England and threats of an invasion of Canada, which are poured forth in some of the American papers. There are many, also, who consider that the present state of things cannot continue much longer if the Confederates continue to hold their own, as they have done hitherto, and that a people who shall have maintained their independence for 2 or 3 years will be recognized by the principal European powers. Such appears to have been the procedure of the European powers in all similar cases, such as the revolt of the Anglo-American and Spanish-American colonies, of the Haitians and the Belgians. In these and other cases, the rule practically adopted seems to have been to recognize the revolters, not at once, but after a reasonable time had been allowed to see whether they could maintain their independence, and this without being understood to have produced any decision either way as to the justice of the cause. Moreover, there are many who say that the Negroes and people of color are far from being kindly or justly treated in the Northern States. An emancipated slave, at any rate, has not received good training for earning his bread by the wages of labor, and if, in addition to this and his being treated as an outcast, he is excluded, as it is said, from many employments by the refusal of white laborers to work along with him, he will have gained little by taking refuge in the Northern States. I have now laid before you the views which I conceive to be the most prevalent among us, and for which I am not myself responsible. For the safe and effectual emancipation of slaves, I myself consider that there is no plan so good as the gradual one which was long ago suggested by Bishop Hines. What he recommended was an ad valorem tax upon slaves, the value to be fixed by the owner, with an option to government to purchase at that price. Thus the slaves would be a burden to the master, and those the most so who should be the most valuable, as being the most intelligent and steady, and therefore the best qualified for freedom, and it would be his interest to train his slaves to be free laborers, and to emancipate them one by one as speedily as he could with safety. I fear, however, that the time is gone by for trying this experiment in America. With best wishes for the new year, believe me, your faithful Reverend Wadley. Among the many letters written from this side of the Atlantic regarding the reply, one was from Nathaniel Hawthorne, in which he says, quote, I read with great pleasure your article in the last Atlantic. If anything could make John Bull blush, I should think it might be that. But he is a hardened and villainous hypocrite. I always felt that he cared nothing for or against slavery, except as it gave him a vantage ground on which to parade his own virtue and sneer at our iniquity. With best regards from Mrs. Hawthorne and myself, to yourself and family, sincerely yours, Nathaniel Hawthorne. End of chapter 16, read for you by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana.